Hello, everybody. This is our AGM, WFDA AGM talk by Donald Ewing, and we have got great pleasure in inviting Donald to be part of a Q&A with myself, Catherine Hewlett, Dr. Catherine Hewlett, and some of our advocates for the WFDA. But first of all, I'm going to do a brief introduction on Donald, if he doesn't mind me doing this. Because he is absolutely awe-inspiring. Donald Ewing has worked as an educational psychologist for 20 years in many settings, from early years, primary and secondary school to third level settings. He's an accredited postgraduate professional qualification in educational psychology from the University of Dundee, and he is a Chartered Psychologist with the Psychological Society of Ireland. Donald is a previous chairperson of the Psychological Society of Ireland's Division of Education Psychology and is an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. He has trained at postgraduate level in primary education at the University of Edinburgh and worked as a teacher in a range of settings in the UK, Ireland and Japan. Donald has worked with Dyslexia Ireland since 2012, and it's in that capacity that Donald will be talking with us today. Donald has worked in policy roles in central government with the Department of Education and Skills, in the Scottish Government and the Department of Children and Youth, and the National Council for Special Education in Ireland. So, Donald, this is really awe-inspiring, the work that you have been doing, and that's the reason why you're here with us today. We wondered whether you might just give us just a short overview on Dyslexia Ireland and what Dyslexia Ireland does.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. I was squirming throughout it, having yourself described. That was very kind of you. Thank you. Yes, so my job at the moment is Head of Education and Policy with Dyslexia Ireland. So we're the national charity in Ireland for dyslexia. Kind of equivalent would be the British Dyslexia Association, or indeed maybe Dyslexia Scotland over in the UK. As a national charity, we have sort of what you'd expect as standard roles. There's policy work, there's advocacy, there's information and awareness raising. And we also we deliver quite a lot of services as well. Mostly those services are delivered because the state doesn't provide them or doesn't provide them in sufficient depth or timeliness. For example, we deliver an educational psychology service where we would assess children, young people and adults for both dyslexia and dyscalculia. And we are running a 1-year waiting list for that service, which is very poor in terms of what we'd like to be able to deliver. But a lot of people do come to us because what they can access through the schools or through employers is either not sufficient or just non-existent. We also offer funding for assessments because it can be an expensive business employing educational psychologists. So if people are on reduced income, we have options there for them, and it's without any horrible means testing process. And part of that is our social justice sort of aspect, because we recognise that literacy or numeracy difficulties can be very disabling in the truest sense of the word if they're not identified and supported as early as possible. We do an awful lot of online stuff these days. The pandemic again helped with that, including our assessment service. About 50% of our assessments are delivered online. And we deliver a range of training webinars for parents, for teachers, for professionals, for schools, on a range of topics, but majority of those would be on identification or support for either dyslexia or dyscalculia. And a lot of our resources, our assets, as we like to call them these days, are video-based because they're accessible from that point of view. And we've got a range of stuff, everything from advocating for your rights in the workplace through to assistive technology in schools, whole range of stuff that we have made available. And all of that is available free of charge via our websites. We actually receive a lot of sort of short-term fundings. What we try to do sometimes is create resources that can be accessed in perpetuity. And sometimes people ask us to create something new and innovative, which is always a bit of a challenge for short-term funding. So what we're trying to do at the moment is trying to bring all those resources into one portal, which would be our main website. But if I'm sharing some links today, you might see some slightly esoteric websites initially, because we've had to host them in different places to begin with. Just a final thing I would say about the association is we work also with other charities, because we recognise that learning differences or neurodivergences don't occur in little tidy boxes like maybe the diagnostic labels would have us believe, or each individual charity would work to. So we recognise that there's a need to try to create joined up services and joined up approaches as much as possible. And part of that's the easy bit, speaking to other charities. The hard bit and challenging bit, which we might touch on in the discussion, is linking with government and linking with not just a department, but numerous departments, whether that's disability, children, education. And then we have a lot of affiliated agencies that maybe have something to do with exams or have something to do with special education in particular. So getting the right people in the room and getting them to listen is one of the biggest challenges we face. But we have made progress in that regard, and sometimes you have to spot opportunities to make that progress. Because I've worked in the UK, then I'm kind of also aware of the differences between different jurisdictions and different systems. So whenever you move, that could be local authorities in London, or it could be moving countries, or it could be moving roles. You spot how things work. And I've kind of had a glimpse on the other side of the fence as a policy advisor or civil servant. I've been in the classroom trying to read those documents and trying to manage multiple needs in a busy school. And I've also now almost feel like a luxury environment now where I can focus on one or two things and drill down into the research and best practice. But constantly the challenge and the opportunity really is to try to make sure that you understand where other people are coming from. Policy advisors have budgets and they have expenditure reports to fill in, and they've got line managers that go all the way to the moon and back. Parents have little time but massive worry. Teachers have little time and overwork. So it's trying to always work in that kind of real world and that realpolitik, because otherwise there's a risk that a charity can just be tone deaf, if you use the phrase, and come across as either pious or for policy advisors come across as annoying and challenging. What we try to do is work collaboratively as much as possible. That doesn't mean we don't get annoyed and kick our bags across the floor sometimes, but we try to do that supportively within our own organisation, and then try to always be fairly optimistic when working with other agencies. It's sometimes hard though. I mean, I was reading a couple of newspaper reports in the UK. One was in England, and one was focusing on Scotland, and they were talking about the massive numbers of additional support needs or special educational needs, the significant rise in diagnoses, and then obviously the in parallel real terms reduction in funding in local authorities that they have to meet needs. And so we're at a very challenging time, I think, in terms of public spend addressing a need that is far outstretching the supply. I'll try not to be too political.
No, and I think that's an absolutely excellent overview. Thank you so much, Donald. I'm just going to slightly go away from some of those questions in the chat, because yeah, I think you've addressed some of the policy here, but I think we're very interested here in the UK to know how linked you are actually with the Irish government, and do they listen to you, and do they give you any funding at all? Because you sound like you're working extremely hard in Ireland to network and get people to hear what you have to say about the needs of neurodivergent people. Do you have the ear of government?
It varies, to be honest, Catherine, because we have to link with so many different departments and agencies. There's a sort of a mixed picture. So, for example, one of our biggest challenges is linking with the State Exam Commission. We only have one exam body in Ireland, a central body, that sets the equivalent of GCSEs and A-level, it does everything around that. It's an external exam body, but the area where we link most with them is around the reasonable accommodations, and they have a scheme. They've got a 100-page document setting it out, and it's okay, but it's far from ideal. And one of the things that you have in England as a norm and as kind of an expected accommodation would be extra time. And we don't
Yes.
have it. We simply don't have it in schools here in Ireland, and we're very concerned about that. We have it if you go to university. You could pop up to Trinity and study law and you would get extra time, but you don't get it with your English leaving certificate, which is our A level. And we have, so in order to address that, we obviously go to the policy officials first, but we were meeting a bit of a brick wall because they seemed not to accept the need for this, despite commissioning an expert advisory group 10 years ago, which said that you should bring it in. So, sometimes if you've watched enough of In the Thick of It or Yes Minster, you can understand how politics and civil service works. So we had a public awareness campaign about it, and we had 35,000 signatures. I think we're above that now. And if you equate that to England and Wales, you could multiply that times 10, which means you have, a third of a million signatures. That gets you a debate in the House of Commons if you get a public petition at that level. So that's the level of support for this campaign. And we've just had a general election in Ireland, and preceding that, we asked for existing TDs, that's our MPs, and senators who are members of the second House, like House of Lords, but a long way from the House of Lords. We got them to sign a pledge that they would support this, and we had multi-party, almost 2/3 of the TDs and senators signed that. So we have political support, we have public support. Our challenge is still getting movement with the exam body. They are conducting a review, but we're travelling a bit sceptically about that. For example, they've written the terms of reference of that review, but haven't consulted on it. So that sounds like a plan is in a drawer already without stakeholders being advised, being appraised of what's happening. But the other thing I would say that one of the challenges of the era of government is it's getting to a meeting. It's the really poor quality stakeholder engagement, like consultations are run, and they're useless. They're very short questionnaires. Tell us what's going well. That's not what we want to do. And the other challenge is sometimes we're invited to the relevant government department or body, and we're around a big table with every other charity and stakeholder, everything from members of the travelling community, people with sensory impairments, autistic people. And you've got an hour and a half meeting, which looks okay on paper, but ultimately you have one opportunity to speak. And that's just very, very tokenistic consultation at that point. What seems to make a big difference, and it shouldn't, but it does seem to, is the individual personalities of the people you're dealing with, and also their own insight into neurodiversity and neurodivergent individuals.
Are you talking about MPs here?
No, civil servants.
Celebrities who will champion for you?
Mostly civil servants, to be honest, because even when you get the celebrity endorsement, so recently the drummer in U2 was in the press talking about his dyscalculia, which is terrific. And we've had, I know in Scotland, we had Jackie Stewart, who was championing the cause of dyslexia about 10 years ago. Now that did get the ear of ministers, and the ministers managed to get the ear of the civil servants, which you would assume they would always be able to, because that's how constitutional democracy works, but it doesn't seem to always work like that. I mean, we had a dyslexia toolkit in schools 18 months after Jackie Stewart started, very efficiently lobbying the powers that be. We shouldn't have to depend on that, to be quite honest. If we were actually, well, what we always say is, if you speak to your neurodivergent learners or employees first rather than last, that would be an improvement. The old analogy, as you probably know, is the one of the ramp into the building. If you clear the ramp of snow, everybody gets in. Where what normally happens is you clear the snow off the steps and then say, we'll come back with the ramp, but we're a bit busy, it's 5 o'clock, we have to clock off now. So putting people truly...
Great analogy.
The nice one is, I think it's a Far Side cartoon that we have in our deck of slides for teachers, and it's never been truer. And we've got better as society, I think, in different countries in different ways, but we've improved things for some people who differ from the norm in terms of social justice or in terms of representation. But even within the disability field, to use the old-fashioned term, there's a hierarchy there, and sometimes the hidden disabilities or the hidden neurodivergencies get missed. And that's things like mental health, it's things like dyslexia, whereas maybe more sensory or physical stuff, because they're more kind of, I suppose they're more obvious, then that can kind of, that sometimes seems to be addressed more easily. And in terms of getting access to the right types of supports in schools, as an ex-teacher and as a psychologist who used to visit schools regularly, I never got near dyslexia as a school psychologist because there was other needs that took precedence when I was visiting. And often that was young people with very challenging behaviour or more complex or profound needs. And that's a pity, but it's also a reality. So we have to think about designing systems whereby we don't always need the most expensive resource addressing what is a broadly predictable need in terms of dyslexia and dyscalculia.
Is there is there an acceptance that challenging behaviours can be about hidden conditions, and and is there an understanding that mental health is actually linked to hidden conditions because of the challenge that people have to deal with? Is there a growing understanding in?
Yes, I think so. It's sometimes hard to tell because I sometimes feel like you can be at risk of being in an echo chamber when you follow certain social media or read certain articles or speak to certain people. Um, I used to work in a school for children with challenging behaviour. That was the reason that they were all in the school together. It was known as the Last Chance Saloon for a particular region of Dublin, and because these kids had been either failed by the system or had failed themselves in mainstream education, and it took me about 3 weeks to work out that a lot of the boys, and they were all boys in my class, a lot of them had very significant literacy challenges. And the story about these kids was that they were so naughty. They were so challenging in their previous school or schools, as it usually was, that they hadn't learned to read. And it was their behaviour which explains why they didn't read. And actually, we got the causality the wrong way around. Majority of them had literacy difficulties. I think about 5 out of 6 of the kids in my class, that was the class size, it shows you what the challenging behaviour was like, had dyslexia that was undiagnosed, that was intergenerationally undiagnosed, frankly.
Yeah. Yes.
And those parents would access social protections, social justice systems. Indeed, some of their parents were in prison. So we know that literacy or unsupported literacy needs is a huge risk factor. And the world of dyslexia often doesn't really talk about that. It sometimes focuses on the more executive dyslexics and the highfalutin celebrities and the very impressive things in the Rockefeller Plaza and groovy websites and multi-billionaires talking about their dyslexia. And I'm not knocking that entirely, but that almost exclusively ignores the realities of the other side of the continuum, which is a massive risk factor for incarceration, massive risk factor for mental health difficulties. And that's very politically sometimes incorrect to be talking about that as an advocacy organisation. I remember we got a bit of kickback when we were doing a lot of stuff with the rehabilitation services in inner city Dublin. That was for people who were recovering from addiction issues. And there was a sort of bristle amongst some of our associates that this was not something maybe we were used to associating with. It was more about people getting their PhDs or people being Entrepreneur of the Year. All of that is important, but it's the social justice bit that it's kind of hard to address. And there's no way any of those 5 kids in my class were getting ever near a dyslexia diagnosis, unless perhaps they were in prison, because there's a prison education system where it might finally afford them the opportunity to have their needs correctly identified.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about social justice, and it does sound like that is the core of Dyslexia Ireland. This is the core of your work. And is this something that you're campaigning for greater access to assessments for young people and adults who come from impoverished backgrounds as well? Because it is a cycle, isn't it? It's an awful cycle of poverty that comes with it.
Yeah. I mean, there's the old adage about dyslexia is a middle class thing. It's only certain air codes or postcodes where you would see if you did some sort of if you did some graphic of London and sort of showed in green the number of dyslexia diagnoses, you would see certain areas dominating. But actually, there's no reason to suggest that should be the case. In fact, because of intergenerational stuff and the impact on income, education, you might expect more dyslexia in certain postcodes than others, or certain boroughs than others. So it is a sort of theme of our work. We also, what we do in Ireland is we have quite good social justice policy in terms of education. We have something called DESH, which is delivering equality of opportunity. in schools, and that means that schools that have a particular socioeconomic demographic get very well funded, and we have reduced class sizes, we have more supports available, they're prioritised for things like therapies and psychologists, etc. And so in theory that should be working by now. We've been doing that for about 2 decades, but it hasn't actually addressed the outcome gap between these schools and other schools, especially not in literacy. One of the reasons for that is we're doing the wrong blooming thing. We're still training people in reading recovery. And it's almost used exclusively in this particular initiative, where we've known, not for very long, to be quite honest, but we've known for quite a long time that that would not be something that would lead to long-term positive outcomes in terms of literacy. But then there's it's a bit like an oil tanker. When you get an initiative like that up and running, people are trained, we have buildings or rooms with, the words reading recovery on the door title, then it takes a long time for people sometimes to start moving away from that to more evidence-based interventions. So even when we fund stuff, we don't always fund it to do the right stuff. And when we do the right stuff, sometimes we don't sufficiently do that with a level of intensity that it leads to outcomes.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting that you're talking about this. You're talking about, reading recovery, and this could be labeling people. You can imagine these young people do not want to pass through that door because that means they will be labeled. It's terminology as well. It's language that is so important. Linked to these the needs of young people and adults as well. It's interesting that you talk about DASH. I have not heard of this, and it does sound quite innovative. It just needs to be embedded more.
Yeah, and I'm only looking at the part of DESH which looks at literacy, to be honest, because there are other metrics where I think success is. But I mean, we've got pretty good figures internationally for people that complete mandatory schooling and continue on to some level of third level program. But again, the devil's sometimes in the detail. It's what we're actually doing, and we also have rather than a local authority-led education provision, which would be the dominant model for schools, if you like, in the UK, where you have a school that reports to an education advisor who reports to a director of education, and the town hall has elected representatives that you vote every 4 years, 5 years in. Here we don't have that system. Each and every individual school in Ireland is a private entity, which is crazy, but it's not quite private. It's a private entity in terms of governance that's only reportable or only reports to its own board of management. However, it receives funding from the Department of Education, from the state, and it has to follow advice set by different bodies. So we have a system called recognition. So the school is recognised, it receives funding. Even private schools in Ireland receive 50% funding for teachers. So there's a load of, if you want to talk about the complexities of the Irish education system, but there's a reason for that. And historians here will tell you that you might have heard of Eamon de Valera, who was one of the members of the state, and features in that film with about Michael Collins, with what's the fella from the north called again? I can't remember his name. Liam Neeson. And anyway, in that, De Valera, when he was drafting up parts of the Constitution, he was a lawyer by trade. The initial draft said the state shall provide education. And then he decided to put a little word in, a 3-letter word, which was, instead of the state shall provide education, it said the state shall provide for education. Because at the time, schools were run predominantly, and are still run predominantly, by the church. So there's a whole level of complexity that was mind-boggling to me when I was used to working in, say, Midlothian Council in Scotland. And I sat in the office, the director of education sat over there, I managed a team of psychologists, and that person managed those schools, that person managed those schools. So it was really quite a tight-knit network. It was a small local authority, but still, you were able to create fairly quick change because you had the ability to just convince a couple of people locally, and you could get 50 head teachers in a room and have the chats with them. Here we've got 3,000, 4,000 schools, all private entities with quite complex governance arrangements, which make the advocacy piece a bit harder. So your part of the world, there are there's always good stuff and bad stuff where you are. That's something that you certainly would benefit from. The difficulty is you've got how many different local authorities. So if you're the national charity, you're probably having to deal with different realities depending on who's in power in a particular local authority, and then how they can construe their systems.
Well, I mean, in England, you're absolutely right, Donald. It is about your local authority, but because local authorities are so cut in terms of funding, for instance, the WFDA, we are nominated the charity for the mayor of Waltham Forest, but we do get very little funding actually, and that has increasingly been the case, and even less so the era of governments because of the drastic cuts that have been going on for this particular work. So you rely on other sources of funding and other ways of networking actually. And you mentioned earlier in your talk about networking with other charities and other organizations, and that's what we do here. You have to have these strong partnerships in order to move forward. It's very interesting what you're saying about Ireland, actually. I mean, I do know that Ireland has got a high, record of progression to university, and attainment exams, higher than the UK, actually. Well, England, let's say that. But from what you're saying, I can now see why these exam boards are actually so powerful.
Mm.
Because of this autonomy that each school has got. And it's important for those schools to have that really strong link with the exam boards to make sure it's all working properly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And an exam board has a very important job and a very difficult job, and they're heavily scrutinized. We have a national obsession about the leaving certificate, which I don't think is mirrored in other jurisdictions. When it comes to that week in June, the DJs on the radio talk about it. If there's a typo in paper one of the English paper, the Irish Times will feature this in a sort of scandalous way. When the results come out, you will, there's a real national interest in this. And I think that's some social and cultural reasons for that. And education is very, very highly prized by majority of parents, and the quality of the education here is reasonably good. I mean, Ireland's had fantastic PISA results. I'm never quite sure how we get fantastic PISA results, but we're right up there with the Japans and the Singapores and the Finlands. And yet, adults, we've got fairly dire figures for adult illiteracy. And that's probably an unpopular word to say illiteracy, but functionally, still we're talking about a fifth or a quarter of adults are still not at the level of 11-year-old reading. So we can't rest on any laurels that we're getting it right in that regard. Teaching is also, I think, probably a slightly higher, how would you say this? It's held in more esteem to be a teacher here than I think it is in parts of the UK. It's slightly better paid. The terms and conditions are better. I think the unions weren't absolutely hammered in the 80s like they were in the UK. So a lot of the teachers will leave school at a reasonable time and will not take 2 hours worth of marking home with them. The flip side of that is we don't train our teachers properly around neurodivergent profiles, especially things like dyslexia. And depending where you are in the country, there is a patchwork level of additional supports, whether that's additional therapies or specialist teachers. And we still have a kind of special education infrastructure, classes, and indeed schools. For example, we've got some state-funded special schools for dyslexia, and they're very good places for very severely dyslexia. But 3 of them are in Dublin, 1's in Cork, and none of them exist anywhere else. So whether or not the data about special schools or inclusion and stuff like that, there's an organically developed education system which leaves big patches or big entire provinces, frankly, where they don't have the same sorts of resources. So that inequality isn't obviously, it's not a good sign that we're getting it right.
Yes, and you can understand why people in Ireland, education is so important, because education is a leap forward, isn't it? And given the history, let's not go into politics, but the history of Ireland, you can understand why the Irish, consider education to be so important. And you have, let's just move on a bit
Sure.
to Europe, shall we? Because some of our advocates are very interested in this, and some of them are here today with us, because you have made that leap forward in Ireland, huge leap, and you are, you're part of Europe, which is, I'll name or cut my colours to the door, which I think is fantastic. And we are no longer obviously part of Europe, and how has that actually, influenced Dyslexia Ireland? Because I know Rosie, your CEO, is very involved in Europe and networks in Europe. Tell us a bit about how that actually enhances your work.
So yeah, we're involved in a lot of Erasmus Plus projects. I think we've been involved in the last maybe decade. We've been involved in maybe 8 or 9, focusing on different things like about dyslexia in the workplace. We've recently completed a project about dyslexia in sport. We haven't led any of those projects directly, but we're increasingly thinking on the next time we do it, we might be the sort of lead, because there's particular topics that we'd like to focus on, and also particular partners that we'd like to sort of work with. Sometimes, it's a bit like the funding model. Ireland used to receive a lot of money from Brussels. Now we give a lot of money to Brussels. So in the same way, we've got a lot of information and expertise now to share with other member states, whereas in the past, maybe we were the ones receiving it. And a couple of times I've been to British Dyslexia Association conferences, and we've left saying we didn't really learn anything brand new. I think we're holding our own here. Whereas in the past, we've come home with lots of PowerPoints going, oh, we wish you had this. So that's good. Rosie is the chairperson of the European Dyslexia Association, and I would say we are a membership that is not predicated on membership of the European Union. So not to counter your initial premise, Catherine, but you still are part of Europe. And certainly when it comes to professional associations, then, obviously 4 countries or the 3 jurisdictions within the UK have a lot to offer and have a lot to gain from that sort of partnership working. And maybe with the new government, things like discovery are back on the table. Maybe Erasmus Plus and freedom of movement for young people seems to be an openness to that, even from people who are brave enough to admit they got it wrong back in 2016. I was actually at an Erasmus event, planning of an Erasmus event the day the vote happened. And when we came down for breakfast on Friday morning, there was shivers down everyone's spine. People were speechless over breakfast. And my dear colleague from Dyslexia Scotland was gobsmacked. What have we done? It hasn't actually had, it's obviously, it was a strange decision for people to make, made on false premises and mild racism. He said slightly.
I know this is recorded. Completely support you in what you've just said, Donald.
So I think it's not been a good time, but the point I think is that there's nothing to stop people working together still, albeit it might not be within certain funded programs like Erasmus. I was actually in my job in the Irish civil service. I used to go to Brussels for meetings, and I was on a committee for youth, and we had 28 members the first meeting I went to, and then the UK member at the second meeting I went to said goodbye to everybody, and everyone was absolutely heartbroken to lose the UK. Do you know? Obviously that was a very pro-EU meeting, and people, their jobs were predicated on a lot of that stuff. But there was a real sense that the EU was losing a lot of innovation and a lot of camaraderie. The Irish delegates also were very depressed because it meant that they were the people that have to spell check everything, because whenever something needed proofread, it was given to you are, and we're like, oh well, our first language is actually Irish, and they said, yeah, we know that's not the case. So I think, continuing to work across borders, especially with electronic means and Zoom meetings, there's nothing to stop you or your colleagues doing 90% of what you were doing before, albeit not under the formal yellow stars of the union, if you like.
That's really heartening to hear, actually, because we have felt, most of London voted against Brexit. Yeah. I can say that quite reasonably, and we have felt almost as though, you're in a bunker now. And what you're saying is that is not the case, actually. And I think, next year, some of us will start to do that and reach out again to Europe. I'm part of Achievability, and our professor, Deborah Kelly, is part of a big European network. And I think, the time is right. And as you say, we now have a different government here in the UK, reaching out to Europe. So it
Yeah,
makes it a lot easier, to be honest.
yeah,
It's very interesting what you have to say, actually, about what is happening in Ireland. And that actually people are, you're now giving funding, and, and you're passing expertise. So, this is a huge sea change for you. Um, there is a question here from one of our autistic advocates. He would like to know how linked up you are with the autism groups in Ireland.
sure. Yeah, well, one mechanism there, so the biggest charity around autism would be As I Am, and they're a very connected organisation. They work very hard to do that, and actually the current Taoiseach or Prime Minister, his brother actually is the chief executive of As I Am. And because of some of that awareness at central government about neurodiversity, it has helped raise the profile of individuals, but either in education, further education, or indeed the workplace. We are a member of a group called Spectrum, which is an umbrella organisation where we link kind of maybe 4 or 5 times a year we meet, and it's As I Am. There's another charity which used to support specific needs of Asperger's, but obviously the terminology stuff has changed there, but they're called Aspire, ADHD Ireland, Dyspraxia DCD Ireland, and there's one other kind of Neurodiversity Ireland, I think. So we do link and share advice, and I say it, As I Am are very established and probably the biggest organisation. We're probably next in terms of infrastructure and kind of reach and longevity. Some of the others are quite small. They maybe have 1 or 2 paid members of staff and sometimes part-time. So there's definitely a sharing of information. For example, the government does a consultation on the literacy strategy, and we're thinking specifically from dyslexia or maybe dyscalculia, but we would share that information with our colleagues, either that a consultation's happening, and we'd regularly meet at the same meeting around the same table. So there's definitely some sharing of expertise and information. And the key thing, and I know this is a truism and well known to your members, but dyslexia doesn't usually come by itself. It's coming with other things. And we also have to help policy officials and people in the health department and people in schools understand that this idea that you have dyslexia and you're autistic and you have a language processing issue. I mean, you're saying, oh, this child's got 3 things wrong with them. We're like, well, actually, maybe it's better to think of overlapping circles.
Yeah.
And the diagnostic kind of historic approach isn't a cumulative one. It's more about understanding dimensions of difference rather than separate differences. And the research on that is really interesting. The chances of you getting a second diagnosis once you've got one massively go down. And that could be about funding if you got to go to 2 different professionals, but it's often about professional bias, that this child has a developmental language difficulty. Therefore, that explains all their literacy difficulties. Therefore, they're not dyslexic or not considered for dyslexia. And we have a big issue with what we've sometimes called dual diagnosis, individuals accessing services. Classic one at the moment we have is kids who are autistic and have a significant mental health difficulty. Nobody wants them. They knock on that door and they say, oh, sorry, it's mental health, we need to speak to CAMHS. You speak to CAMHS and you say, well, we don't deliver mental health services for people who are autistic. And, that has got to almost crisis point where families, especially during periods of lockdown related to COVID, families were in great distress and the system literally there was no door to go to. So it was encouraging to see some of the party manifestos before the recent election talk about that issue about, no one is ever turned away, despite what they have, or indeed what they don't have. And just a final thing about that, it's really interesting. There's some legal advice that we're aware of at the moment, which is saying, classically, if you went to the University of East London and said, I'm neurodivergent and I have dyslexia or I'm autistic, the first thing they would probably ask for, and most of us would say that's reasonable, I suppose, is, can we see some paperwork to back up what you're telling us? Do you have proof? And it's usually a psychologist report. And sometimes, depending on where you're going or what you have, you're asked for different things. And there's a page on a website saying it must be no more than 2 years, or it must have a score at this, must be signed by. And all of that we've kind of put up with. But increasingly, legal advice that we're accessing is saying that bar is far too high. And people are putting, or organizations are putting barriers in place for people who are coming. If you came and you said, I mean, when you get a doctor's note now, the doctor doesn't say what's wrong with you. It says you were signed off due to ill health. So you don't have to say why you went to the doctor to take 3 days off. But when you're neurodivergent, you're sort of expected to provide all these reports, which might be from when you were 9 years old or include lots of quite personal information. So the lawyers seem to be saying that maybe we need to reduce that burden of proof to a much, much, much more reasonable one, which could be self-report. If I say to my line manager, I'm autistic, she should say to me, I believe you. And what can we do about it? Rather than saying, can you please go to your mother's house and dig your report out the filing cabinet? So that's an interesting issue because, again, I think we've been used to just accepting this, provide a report, get a new report, this report's out of date, you have to go to that type of person. All of that, particularly here, comes with massive waiting times or massive costs. I mean, an autism assessment here can set you back €2,000.
Yeah.
Or you're waiting 5 years.
It's kind of similar in the UK, but what we do have is we have access to work for adults who will accept a screening which is free.
Good.
They will accept that. And there are some universities who will provide free assessments to neurodivergent people, but there is still an issue for young people in schools, and we do have educational psychologists, etc. But as you say, there's huge waiting lists. And the problem is that, as you say, there is a lack of understanding about the integrated nature of conditions, that the overlapping conditions. And there's a very high percentage of people who have overlapping conditions, but it's easier to deal with one label at a time.
Yes, indeed. If we were designing a really good system, I always think if you start from scratch, what would it look like if we were designing systems? I think, and some of our Scandinavian cousins have got it not quite perfect, but they're working with. You have this idea of a child development clinic, where you go in and people look at you in the round from day one. Obviously, you can't really look at dyslexia until people go to school, but from day one, you can start to look at how language and socialization and processing interact. And also we have to challenge quite a lot of the diagnostic and assessment methodologies that are currently in play. We're still fighting discrepancy model here, where people go for a dyslexia assessment. The first thing a uninspired psychologist will do is do a full IQ assessment on you. And there's still an expectation for some resources to have an IQ above 90. And then people are saying, well, do you know that these tools are biased against people that are neurodivergent, even when you're looking for neurodivergence? The irony is quite amazing. And I think this idea of designing services around a modern understanding of what neurodivergence looks like. I mean, think how much ADHD has been missed historically, how much behavior difficulties are down to traumatic experiences or attachment difficulties. We've set up services in a way that was reasonable at the time, and then we've not really updated them. So I think we need to really think quite widely. My own view about the politics about this is I think there's certain things that a civilized society would say, this is not about party politics. So climate change and education, we should say not allowed to have differing views, because you can't have a swing for 5 years or 10 years and then try and swing right back. Think of Sure Starts, for example. What amazing work Sure Starts did. And then it was like attacked deliberately by the Tory government to dismantle that stuff, and we're picking up the pieces. It was almost as if, and it's really hard, COVID's taught us this as well, it's hard to pick up pieces. Youth work in inner city Dublin was stopped for 9 months, and the connection with vulnerable families was lost almost forever, because it was siblings and there was a connection, and it had to be in person, it had to be knocking on doors, had to be dropping into youth centres. And then there was an opportunity then, now people are saying, well, that youth centre's not being used, you're not meeting your targets, you're not meeting your KPI, so we'll probably divert that funding. We've not really learned very much. So I think what we need is really long-term 20-year planning for some of this stuff. Advocates at the centre, not at the periphery. So people like As I Am, people like the WFDA should be in the room at the start when they're drafting up, when it's post-it notes and flip charts, rather than brought in at the end when they're literally about to press play on the publishers. You know, our message here is all government should provide government documents in 2 languages, because we have 2 first languages here, Irish and English. So our message is always, if it's about to go to the Irish translators tomorrow, you know the consultation is tokenistic, because they're not about
How
to
interesting. It's really interesting. Well, Donald, thank you so much. We have a few more minutes, and you mentioned advocates, and we do have a set of advocates here. So I am going to go to the gallery now, and we have Kenya, who is works in Rwanda, but is here in England at the moment. We have Dee, who works getting funding for the Arts Council and doing projects in London. Alicia, who works with a lot of alternative therapies, and I think Rose is with us as well. Now, Kenya, you have a question which you put in the chat for Donald. Would you like to ask that question?
Yes. Thank you for gracing us with your presence, Donald, and I've really enjoyed your contribution so far. And it does ring a lot of bells with me, because I am at the very early stages of creating awareness around dyslexia in Rwanda, though I don't call it that. I call it different learning abilities, because it's not a term they're familiar with. They're not aware of neurodiversity. They are aware of autism, and they fear any type of exploratory work that I'm doing, because they're saying it might create families to be ostracized if it's out that they've got other conditions. So I'm doing what I'm doing on the down low. I'm creating a learning hub at the moment. I won't go into too much detail about that, but what's interested me is what you were saying about a dyslexia toolkit, and I wondered what's involved in that, and whether there is something about it online that I could access. And then the other question I have is, do you have any connections? Does Dyslexia Ireland have any connections with countries in Africa that are trying to create awareness around dyslexia?
I'm not sure about the last part, although one of my colleagues, one of my educational psychologists, is originally from South Africa, and I know she's done some work with Kenyan colleagues or Nigerian colleagues recently. So there may be some, I can ask Taryn about that and see if she could send that information on to myself and then to Catherine. In terms of the toolkit, there's various toolkits out there. So for a long time, BDA, for example, would have a dyslexia-friendly schools. So it was a sort of paper-based best practice checklist type approach, and the idea was, you know, a bit like a green flag. If you're an eco-friendly school, you could have a dyslexia-friendly school. If you had everything from policies to individual practice to partnership with parents, a whole range of stuff. We haven't ever gone down that route specifically in terms of the infrastructure around that, but the toolkit in Scotland, for example, that was focused on teachers. It was awareness raising, screening, and advice about literacy interventions that was sent to every school in the country, and it was kind of landed on the learning support teacher's desk primarily to say this is what is representing best practice and how are you shaping up. For our own part, we've got a range of resources, and one of the things we would always say is, well, there's no intellectual property when we're concerned. We want to share everything. You might cite us, but we don't believe in sort of selling stuff and believe me, that sounds kind of normal, but the dyslexia world is such a marketplace and always has been, often because people have disposable income sometimes for this sort of thing, whether that's coloured overlays and lenses and all that sort of stuff, which has, you know, questionable evidence behind. There's a lot of stuff out there you could use. The initiatives we've really spent a lot of time in the last few years has been our hubs. So you've got a dyslexiahub.ie and adultdyslexiahub.ie. And these are primarily video-based resources where we support either mental health and well-being, partnership with schools, and we've got hours and hours of videos doing structured literacy lessons. In the kids' case, it's with an online lessons with a young person during COVID that we got permission to record, anonymized the young person, but we have like 40 to 60 hours of learning from basic phonics right through. So if someone was wanting to focus on basic literacy awareness, either as a first-time learner of English with dyslexia or a young person who might be very dyslexic, that resource is available free of charge. It's hosted on YouTube. It's on our website. So things like that, when we're lucky enough to get short-term funding, when we're lucky enough to get short-term funding, we try to create something that has a legacy rather than employ someone for a year and they go away and you go, that was a shame. Remember we had Marjorie, she was really good. So Marjorie, if she works for us for a year, we're like, we want you to create something where there's legacy around that. So there's a whole range of stuff on our hubs and on our website to do with that. A thing that's coming online quite soon, we're just finalising it, is also guidance for schools when choosing literacy interventions for dyslexic learners. Because we talked a bit about reading recovery, but there's a bunch of stuff that's being used currently in Irish schools, ranging from quite good to pretty good to actually a few schools actually excellent. And then at the other side, we've got stuff that is not ideal and stuff that's a bit toxic in terms of helping things like spelling. And we're still slightly in the dark ages, or we're still using the same resources we maybe used since the 90s for some of that stuff. So our up-to-date guidance, ideally we'd be able to look at the research and evidence base and say, can we compare intervention X versus intervention Y? And there's been 1,200 studies, and we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence, because of meta-analyses, that this is better than this, so we should all do this. We don't have that level of research or that depth or rigor of research. So what we've done is looked at the general science around reading and spelling and literacy issues and say, well, a good literacy intervention must have this, 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 and this. It'd be nice if it had this, this, and this, but it's not essential. And we've also created what we've called red flags, which is things to avoid when working with dyslexic students. And we're at the moment of plain Englishing that to try and avoid as much jargon as possible, which is a challenge when you're working with things like phonemes and orthographies. But that should be coming out in January, and we'll be promoting that through our social media. So that hopefully will be a very useful tool for either learning support teachers or school leaders, deputy principals, etc., when choosing new resources or when deciding which resources from their resource cupboard to discontinue, without necessarily banging them on the head and saying you've been doing the wrong thing for 20 years, because people don't respond very well to being told off, you know.
Okay, does that answer your question, Kenya?
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'll put little links in the chat there. I'll tell you what I'll do. I can't multitask to that level, so I'll send on the links to the two hubs I talked about, and obviously our main website has links to them as well. So it's dyslexia.ie for all of that stuff.
Thank you so much, Donald. Has anybody else got any final questions for Donald? Dee or Alicia?
Yes, I have, Donald. It's regarding the developmental therapeutic pathways. I was thinking, is there anything around nutritional needs or psychologists that's well trained in trauma or to make the short-term funding a long-term funding? Or is it important in terms of the importance of therapeutic pathways? I don't know how far it comes down the line of what you've already discussed.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think the approach that all organisations are being encouraged to take around trauma is what we would call generically trauma-informed practice. So it's recognising that whether you're a primary school or you're an organisation employing adults, people may be coming with traumatic experiences that may still have a very direct or indeed sometimes a more indirect influence on their functioning or their well-being. And and many of those will be unseen to you, and many will not be disclosed to you. So it's trying to take a kind of almost like a UDL approach to trauma, a universal design to trauma, to sort of create systems where there are direct supports as available, but also there is a general inclusive environment for people who may be coming with short-term or more long-term or deep-seated issues. Getting funding for that, well, if you're an organisation like a bank or a university, you're kind of expected to do it. But a lot of our state psychologists are talking a lot about trauma-informed practice when they're going into schools. And that's the stuff that we've known for ages. You know, that's why things like Sure Starts and breakfast clubs are always important, because we recognise that a young person coming into school at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning may not have education at the level of priority that the teacher does. And that's because they've come from a long-term or short-term background, which has been either very actively traumatic or perniciously traumatic with multiple factors, not having breakfast being one, for example, worried about domestic violence or the threat of domestic violence for another. And when you throw dyslexia into the mix there, it becomes another risk factor which can be exacerbated by or exacerbate other issues. So we're always we don't try to overplay that, because you're often trying to provide reassurance around dyslexia, but we say, look, this can also interplay with other challenging aspects of people's lives. Alicia, your first question, I maybe didn't misheard you, but you saying nutritional?
Yeah, nutritional.
Is that like in terms of supplements or diet and things like that?
Both.
So
Because the reason why I say that is because there is a difference in the nutritional value of food at present.
Yeah.
So this is where I would say that as well.
Yeah. So I think generically, as an educator, I think everything from Jamie Oliver back, 10 years ago, talking about Jamie's meals, we realised that even when we funded food in schools, we were giving kids a lot of really ultra-processed crap, which we wouldn't, the people funding that wouldn't feed their own children at home. It's a bit, there are a lot of things like that. Teachers in a school wouldn't tolerate the toilets that we give to children to use. Do you know, if you're a 13-year-old and you have a monthly episode and you have to go and use that disgusting toilet, it's unsafe and unclean. And so we often don't get the kind of basic Maslow's needs correct in that regard. So I think we do, yeah, of course, your GP will always have in her mind sleep and exercise and nutrition, no matter what you're coming at. It could be sore elbow, or it could be, mental health issues. So we need to get the basics right, I think, as much as possible. And again, Sure Starts and breakfast clubs and good quality hot meals is one of them. When it comes to specific nutritional supplements or supports or fish oils or a range of those sorts of approaches, I don't spend a lot of time looking at the research, so I'd have to say Socratic, not sure about this, but the research up till now has suggested maybe some general benefits for things like brain functioning, but nothing specific that I've seen for things like dyslexia or dyscalculia. There are also some pharmaceutical approaches that, for example, if you're an undergraduate student in America, you're at risk of being convinced that you have to take this tablet to help you pass your exams. So there are some stuff out there that we don't tend to have much to do with. The bottom line, we would probably say, again, going back to common sense principles, that your GP would probably say, if you're generally healthy and you're eating a generally good diet, you may not need to take any extra supplements, bar from maybe vitamin D, because we live in the darkest part of Europe, at this time of year. And even then, if you're eating enough fruit and veg, you might be fine for that sort of thing. So it's not something we talk about an awful lot in terms of nutritional supplements, etc. Again, we're always interested in that, but the threshold for evidence needs to be super high, because again, parents and adults with dyslexia are very vulnerable to slick marketing for everything and anything. And the more alternative it is, sometimes you want to, sounds too good to be true, but actually, the joke I always said is I play golf twice a year. And every time before I go and meet my old college buddies who play golf a lot, to play golf, I think I have to buy a new bit of kit to get better at golf. So I buy a driver with a big head or something like that, or I'm going to get these tees, that'll help. That's the thing that'll help me. And guess what? I'm rubbish at golf. And guess what happens when I play golf twice a year? I'm not very good at it. Hit it sometimes, don't hit it other times. The reality is practice is what I should do. But I'm open to slick marketing, because I talk about golf and then Google says, you buy this. And our parents with this, I've been at British Dyslexia Association events where they've had a keynote lecture talking about the lack of evidence base around coloured overlays. And everyone's go, oh, crikey, that's challenging for us because we sometimes use that or we still use it. But there's the evidence, hard research to not back up this approach. And you come out into the lobby and there's a guy selling coloured overlays for €29. And you're thinking, how does this match up? So that's one of the things one of our challenges actually, we're approached by companies saying, this is brilliant for people with dyslexia. And my first question is, how do you know that? And you know,
Yeah.
oh, we've got testimonials on our website, and it's Deirdre from Cork, or Darina from Mayo says this is brilliant. And we go, well, that's fine if you're running a Thai restaurant, and you're at, you know, the risk of spending money in one place over another is not that great, but it's quite fraught for adults who, or parents who are, you know, even if they have finance, they've only got a bit, and they have to think about prioritising that.
It
Thank you
does.
so much. Oh,
So I'm
carry
just
on.
gonna, just one thing, it's just it is sustainable when you're talking about fruits and vegetables. And when you go to the ground level of actually a seed, it's not very expensive, and people do have gardens that they can utilize, you know. And there are ways that can yeah.
It's
Yeah, no.
about the whole person, isn't it? It's about the whole
Yeah.
person, and that's what Donald touched on actually earlier. You know, it's about education, it's about health, and it's about our environment. It's
But
holistic.
if it's okay, I've written down some notes. Off the top of my head, I can't think right now. But is it possible for me to email you my thoughts, and then it can be passed on to
Absolutely, yeah. Catherine has
yeah,
my email, so feel free
that
to
would be
email
great.
in anytime. Yeah.
Thank you.
Because we're nearing the end now, and you know we've had over an hour of Donald, so I think that's absolutely fine, Alicia, and thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you, Kenya, for your contribution. And you know, you're all doing sterling work, but you know, thank you so much to Donald Ewing for what you have given to us today. You know, it's been fantastic. So enjoyed the conversation, and you're doing fantastic work in Dyslexia Ireland. And what's so impressive about you, Donald, is that you see it through the lens of not only different cultures, but different human conditions as well. So we just want to say thank you to you, Donald, and we're just going to stop the recording now. Thank you.